curve. And you compare that to modern horses, they're even bigger still. So apparently that was the best end of the bell curve to be at, and you get an even bigger distribution like that in modern horses. Now, I don't have a good example of where having the minimum of the trait is best. Actually, I guess I can sort of make one up just off the top of my head. A lot of animals that live in the Arctic have white fur, because I guess that helps them blend into the snow a little bit better, and you're a better predator or a better prey if you blend in with the snow. And so if you think about the color genes for your fur, in that case having less color in the fur is a little bit better. And so we have so many white animals in the Arctic because they all shifted towards the minimum end of their bell curve for fur color. So that would still be directional selection, any extreme of the bell curve. Another type of natural selection could be what they call stabilizing selection, where to be in the middle of the bell curve is the best. And so natural selection tends to scrunch the curve inward because the extremes are bad. And they think human birth weight is an example of that. When they look at the distribution of the sizes that people are born at, their birth weight, it looks like the curve looks like this. It's a very tight curve. And what they think is going on here is this. Before we had medical intervention, it was bad to be born at a very small size just because you tended to be smaller and weaker in that state. But it was also bad if you were born too large because there was complications passing through the birth canal of the mother. Nowadays they can do C-sections and things like that if it's going to be a problematic birth, but obviously they couldn't back in the Middle Ages and whatnot. So they think natural selection has sculpted us towards a very narrow distribution of birth weight. And lastly, there's something called disruptive selection, which is sort of the opposite of stabilizing selection. In disruptive selection, both extremes are good, but you don't want to be in the middle. That's the bad region to be in. And this is an example I pulled out of another textbook. Somewhere in England, somebody was studying this type of garden snail. And what the person found is the snails either had a very dark brown shell or a very vivid, bright yellowish striped shell. And it's the same species of snail, but they didn't seem to find any that were halfway in between. Like a nice even mixture of the brown and the yellow. And what they found is that these snails, even though they were one population, either tended to hang out in some very dark grass, in which case being darker was better, or they tended to hang out in a much brighter environment. I'm not sure what that is, but maybe something with bright yellow flowers, and so being bright yellow helped you blend in better. But if you were anywhere in the middle, then you were spotted, you were more easily seen, either in the dark grass or the bright flowers, and so the birds would come along and eat you. There we go. So you can see that evolutionists tend to eliminate the middle, but both extremes are the good ones to be in. Okay, just as kind of a drill, I thought I'd present some scenarios to you. Some of these are real and some of these I'm just making up, but tell me which of these three types of selection, natural selection, you think it is. Okay, imagine that there's some sort of clover that grows in an area, and deer come along and eat the clover, and obviously the clover doesn't want to be eaten. And so let's say it evolves some sort of defense. Maybe it starts making some sort of poison that the deer don't like the taste of, or makes the deer sick. Which type of selection do you think might be going on there in the clovers? You'd think it was directional at first. You think, okay, the more of the poison they have, the worse they're going to taste and the less they'll be eaten. So I think that would be a good first guess. But what if I made it a little more complicated and said, if you start making too much of the poison, you devote so much of your nutrients to making the poison that you can't sustain your own growth, then what do you think it would be? Then it would tend to be stabilizing, yeah, because then it's best to be in the middle. If you make no poison, you get eaten because you don't taste bad. But if you make too much poison, you don't have any spare nutrients to sustain your own growth, and that's not going to be good for you. Here's another one. This is a real example. There's a species of finch in Africa, and what they found is the main sources of food are either these seeds or or insects. And they watched the birds feeding on these things, and they found that for seeds, you need a big, strong, bulky beak to crack open the seeds. Or with the insects, a smaller beak is better, because I think the birds have to reach inside little holes in the trees to get the insects. And so what sort of selection would we expect there? Disruptive, that's right. I guess you can kind of see it from the distribution. When they look at the beak sizes, if you have a small beak, that helps you get the insects. If you have a large, bulky beak, you can crack open the seeds, but they don't find any of these finches right in the middle, because then you get out-competed by the long beak ones and the small beak ones. And this is one you may have heard of, because this one tends to show up in a lot of textbooks. There's a species of moth over in England called the pepper moth, and there's some variability in its color. Some of them are very light and some of them are very dark. But these moths like to land on a particular tree with a white bark, where they don't want to be seen, because they'll get eaten by birds. And if we assume that the tree is very white, what sort of selection would we expect? It should be directional. You'd say, okay, that the whiter you are, the more you're going to blend in with the tree and you're going to survive better. And that's what they found. But what makes this kind of interesting is, these moths in these trees have been around for thousands, if not millions of years. But in the late 1700s and early 1800s, England industrialized, and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they started burning a bunch of coal. And what they found is the soot got on these trees in this area and made them very dark. And so suddenly it was better to be a dark moth than a light moth. Just within a few tens of years, the situation had flipped itself. And so now having the dark extreme was better, and that's what they found out happened to the moth population. They all shouldn't say they all, but the bulk of them shifted to more of the dark pigmentation than the light pigmentation.
What will be the most rapid evolutionary generation?
Like what would be what?
The most rapid, something like that. Do you see that in a generation?
In a generation or two? I think so. I remember some people some modern biologists went back to the Galapagos and studied the finches, and what they found, even in some seasons, if it was a dry season, a certain type of seed would grow and you'd need a larger beak to eat it. And in other seasons, when there was more rain, a different type of seed would grow and you need a smaller beak to eat it. And even within 1 year to another, they saw the beak size in the finch population would shift back and forth. And so you can at least get some change within one generation. Okay, just a quick recap or should say a reminder of our species definition. This species is a group of organisms that can make fertile offspring with each other. Two things can breed and make offspring with each other, and those offspring are fertile. They're considered the same species. What we've been talking about so far is sometimes called microevolution, and it means that you don't get a new species, but you're just shifting the allele frequencies within the species. Like the beak sizes of those finches, they still stay the same species. They can still breed with each other, but sometimes the beak size gets longer and sometimes the beak size gets smaller. One of Darwin's insights was to get that idea from Lyell that, yeah, you might have slow gradual change, but if it goes on for millions of years, like the Grand Canyon being formed by the slow erosion from the Colorado River, if you get the slow gradual change over millions of years, you end up with a huge change. And so Darwin said, if we have allele frequencies shifting within every generation, and it goes on for millions of years, you're eventually going to get so much genetic change that what we get is a new species, and that is sometimes called macroevolution or speciation. there's a diagram showing it. If you start off with one original species like this, that species can change over time until you get two or more entirely different species from the original species. So what I want to do here is give you a very quick condensed version of the evolutionary history of life on Earth. And I kind of like this. I always like delivering this part of the lecture because it's absurd in the sense that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and I'm going to try to condense this all down into 5 minutes or so. Here we go. I saw this play one time. It was called All of Shakespeare's Plays Abridged, and it was like a 1-hour play where they were the actors were running around changing costumes, doing a few lines from Hamlet and doing a few lines from the 12th Night and stuff like that to try to cram it all in. And it's anyway, so here's my version of it. So they think the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old, and they think at first there was no life on Earth just because when the Earth was first formed, it was very volcanic and there was hot lava and the atmosphere was very different. It just wasn't suitable for life. But as things began to settle down and some of the lava cooled and turned into the crust and some oceans formed, the conditions were more right for life to first form. And they think that happened around 3.5 billion years ago. If they look at some very ancient rocks that they believe were formed around that period, they find some tiny microscopic shapes within the rocks that are about the right size as prokaryotes, sort of microscopic fossils. So that's when they think that life actually started. And they're not exactly sure how you go from non-life to life. I mean, it's as simple as prokaryotes are. There's just a gigantic leap between lifeless chemicals and an actual living cell. But there are some clues, at least, even if they don't fully understand it, they have some clues. They believe that the basic building blocks of life, like nucleotides and amino acids, can form on their own. There was a famous experiment called the Miller experiment, where this scientist tried to recreate the conditions of Earth inside a test tube, basically. They think the atmosphere had a lot of methane, CH4 gas, and a lot of nitrogen, which I guess it still has a lot of nitrogen, but not very much oxygen, because I think the oxygen came later when photosynthesis evolved. Anyway, so he took this ancient mixture of atmospheric gases and put lightning sparks through the test tube, or I should say electrical sparks to simulate lightning through the test tubes. And then he let this thing go for several days. Oh yeah, and heat down here to simulate like hot springs and natural volcanic action. And after letting this thing just crank away for several days, various organic molecules were formed by the chemical reactions between the atmospheric gases as catalyzed by the electrical sparks and the heat going on here. And he created some of the basic building blocks of life. So you can find some amino acids forming and nucleic acids of various types forming. Because if you think about it, we have all the carbons and hydrogens and nitrogens and oxygens that we need to form these molecules there. And so at some point, they think those molecules began to reproduce themselves. And they're not sure how that works exactly, but you sometimes hear of a theory called RNA world. And what they mean by this is they think perhaps RNA molecules were the first ones that can reproduce themselves. And here's one of the reasons why they think that. Imagine an RNA molecule, I'm just making this up, GUUAGC, something like that. If this molecule could come into existence, in a way it could encode its complementary sequence, because by complementary base pairing, it would tend to match up with its complementary sequence. Like that. So it could essentially make a complementary strand. And what they found out is that RNA molecules can have enzymatic activity. Our enzymes these days are mostly proteins, but if you think about what we talked about this semester, there's things like transfer RNAs, which have some enzymatic activity, and ribosomes are partially made out of RNA, and they have enzymatic activity. And so in a way, this thing could make an enzyme just based on its own sequence. So anyway, they think the first molecules that could reproduce themselves were RNA molecules, and then at some point, those managed to surround themselves by a plasma membrane, and you had what would be considered the first life form, or at least something that was the forerunner of life forms. In any event, although they don't know exactly how it got started, based on the fossil evidence, the prokaryotes were the first organisms to form, the bacteria domain and the archaea domain. And that was around 3.5 billion years ago. And for about 1 billion years, the prokaryotes were the only life forms on Earth. And then somehow, some of them managed to evolve into eukaryotes. There's some prokaryotes. They think that the archaea are a little bit closer to the eukaryotes than the bacteria are, so probably they were the ancestors of the eukaryotes. On this chart right here are the two prokaryotic domains, and the 4 squares above here are the eukaryotic domains. The simplest of the eukaryotic kingdoms is the protista. These are mostly single-celled eukaryotes. And some of the protistans are photosynthetic, and some are non-photosynthetic. Here's a picture of one of the non-photosynthetic ones. This is called a paramecium.